Great. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see at the fag end of the day an encouraging crowd like this. We thank you for making time and having the energy to be here. We believe it's a suitable finale to a day which has been well spent around the theme of change that this festival is all about. We've been debating two things essentially throughout the day. We've been talking about change. We've been talking about the disruptions that the change brings in with it. We've been talking about the challenges that the change brings with it for the business world, for the corporate sector. And we've been trying to figure out ways in which we can drive growth within change. That's essentially the dilemma, and that's where we spend the day today. I'm happy to anchor the session now for two reasons. One, we believe through the Best Indian Brands league table that we spend considerable time analyzing and measuring every year, and it's built along the lines of Best Global Brands that in brands got a fair bit of thought leadership around. It's an empirical evidence, and it's a definitive evidence of how brands have navigated change to drive growth. Two essential things, change and growth. Are they really enemies? Are they eating each other up in a Pac-Man style, as the graphics suggest? They shouldn't be, because you're talking about Change Festival, and it's about celebrating change. And we quite firmly believe that if it is not seen as an opportunity, if change is resisted because of inertia, because of habit, or because of fear, then it would create a whole lot of issues. Let's look at a historical perspective, and this, since we're talking about league tables, this is one of the top three league tables alongside Great Places to Work and Interbrand's Best Global Brand. Fortune 500, the 2000 table had 52% of brands from there that don't exist anymore. 52% of Fortune 500 in 2000, that set of companies have either gone out of business, have gone bust, have either been acquired, or they just shut shop. That's the historical perspective of people who did not cope with change. Let's look at a future perspective. This is another ranking. It's S&P 500, and what it says is that 75% of today's S&P table will not exist in 2027. It's about change destroying legacy brands. It's about change really being a villain of the piece and eliminating more than half, 52% of Fortune 500 over in less than 2 decades have vanished from that table, and 75% of this one will vanish by 2027. If you look at our own league table, which is Best Global Brands, ranking a top 100 brands in the world by brand value, well, there is this interesting brand at number 5, which in 2009 was at number 5. And Nokia was a popular brand in India. In 2012, it just dropped off the table, and we know where it is today. It is about not an option of trying to keep pace with change. It's no longer about somehow coexisting with change. It's about the only real way is to drive growth in change. And if you don't do that, we perish. It's essentially because of certain deeper meanings that exist, that explain the two pivotal principles that we're really talking about today, which is growth and change. If you look at the anatomy of change, and if you compare it to the anatomy of growth, you'll find some fundamental differences. And if you look at those meanings before we can really figure how to navigate change for growth, it might be useful. So let's begin with the anatomy of change. Anatomy of change really is about organizations that begin in a linear fashion with a set of functions around distribution and finance and HR and stuff like that. And in a world that has few touch points, in consumption world or in the decision making or the purchase journeys, a set of finite touch points. We all learned about those phenomenal models during our studying days of awareness, interest, desire, and action, ADA, and simple linear journeys. And that was the world that we grew up in. What's the anatomy of change? It's technology that's enabled a proliferation of touch points. We often talk about technology, digital, changing businesses, making it difficult. Why does that happen? What's the fundamental reason why digital and technology is impacting our businesses? It's principally because the way people go about making their decisions today has altered. In a more technical language, it's the customer journeys and the touch points that have evolved from a linear 4 to 6 to hundreds of touch points that you consult. And that's what's really the fundamental reason why businesses have gotten impacted by digital, by technology. What's even more interesting is that this proliferation is not static. The proliferation, the newer touch points really talk to each other. It's a really funny situation. It's not the most impressive of graphics, but it's about, imagine an organization which is caught up in this world where there is a proliferated set of touch points, and not just they are proliferated from 4 and 6 to 200 and 300. We track purchase journeys of car buyers and things like that in different parts of the world, in Asia and Europe. And there were over a 3-month period of a typical car buying prospect in Europe, there were 305 touch points that the car buyer went through. And the complication is that those touch points were actually influenced by each other. And there is this, therefore, the brand and the organization that's trying to navigate itself in this new reality of change, and that's really the anatomy of change that we're talking about. That's the anatomy of change that creates challenge for organizations. What it does is to create this connectivity Brownian. It's about these touch points that are really floating around, and how do organizations react to that? Well, they set up teams. You got in the 2000 late 90s, and there was a .com, and therefore a whole lot of web design agencies mushroomed, and you set up a web design function, people to coordinate with that. And then YouTube came and you wanted to create content, you set up a team for that. And then social media became big, and then you created, and the social media agencies sprouted all around, you created a social media function, and that coexisted with your traditional functions around communication, around HR, around distribution, and stuff like that. Eventually you created this proliferated set of internal organization that didn't really talk to each other either. And whereas the brand was still trying to find what it does, and maybe it found some solace in communication and in brand design. If you move on to anatomy of growth, this was anatomy of change. What's the anatomy of growth that we can talk about? Anatomy of growth is really anchoring all these inefficiencies and all these proliferations and all this is siloed coexistence of external and internal structures that are trying to manage this change in a random manner and creating this entire connectivity Brownian. How do you really solve it? How do you really crack it? And that's what explains the anatomy of growth, because growth essentially, as different from change, is more cohesive. It's more structured. It's more pregnant within the present for possibilities of future. Any metaphor we take, nature or human, it's always coming together and assimilating and nurturing and being consolidated, and that's how you grow. And if we were to really fight the anatomy of change, it's from our perspective, and we being people of brands and marketing, like a lot of you here, I think the solution is in defining the anatomy of of growth centered around the brand that really pulls everything together and creates a platform that you can converge, that you can anchor, that you can integrate things with. And what it does is creates value. How does it create value? It creates value through the basic principles of efficiency. It's no rocket science. You were investing in all these things earlier as well, but they were not really synergizing. And now you are investing, maybe you are investing lesser, but you got a platform that converges them. And that's what we bring in as a brave brand that provides anchorage and kind of takes on this anatomy of change, which creates the connectivity Brownian. So it's brave growth which kind of asserts itself within the connectivity Brownian. It's got the ability to take a quick short-term decision because you know that you are anchored in a long-term vision and purpose. It does another interesting thing. It actually says don't go with the flow of how things are. Intercept the future. It's not just about, and I know we have an event called Flow, but it is about not just going with it. It's about intercepting it, and that's what we can do with an anchorage of brand, which allows you to also focus and kind of, a lot of you who are managing resources, and we were talking about certain categories the other day where every time there is a new innovation, there's a new brand that's created. And there are sectors that do that. There is realty, there is auto, and there are a whole lot of sectors that we really spend time in that proliferate their efforts so much that it becomes, the encumbrance on the resources is so high that it kind of distracts and creates an opportunity loss. You just can't do what you ought to do because you try and do so many different things which are disparate. And if you could converge that, then you'd get time, you'll free yourself up to kind of engage in predictive intelligences, to anticipate and prepare rather than constantly react, which is what we do most of the time today. So if you summarize the anatomy of change and the anatomy of growth with challenge of connectivity Brownian and anchoring and accelerating through brands, the change is driven by people and technology. It's technology that enables a lot of opportunities for driving connectivity, for driving interconnection, and people begin to change. People begin to behave differently, begin to buy differently, begin to interact socially differently, begin to troll differently, and so on and so forth. And what happens, therefore, is it creates this immense connectivity Brownian and a challenge. And to solve that, what do? You basically bring in the brand as an interface. So the brand is, as we saw in the best global brands league tables over the last year, and that's what we're seeing in the league table that we will talk about, we will share in a few minutes' time, it's an year of reckoning, so to say, globally as well as locally. Year of reckoning because many things that we've been talking about for many years, it's like that one day it would happen and that day is happening. That day is now. That day is now because all the efforts and all the conversations that were happening around we should do this with technology and we should do this with governance, we should do this with brands, we should do this with global aspirations and so on and so forth. They have been tried. We should do this with experience. They've been tried, they've been invested in by some of the progressive brands that we would love to celebrate shortly. And while they've been talked about for some of the recent years, the year of reckoning in 2018 was when they began to pay off and they began to create value, tangible value. And that's why we believe globally as well as locally, 2018's been a year of reckoning where all those things that we spoke about as things to do for future and someday it'll pay off did begin to happen and did begin to translate into real value creation. What do brands do? What can brands do? Brands can provide anchorage. Brands can therefore drive efficiency. Brands have the powerful role built on simple principle of value creation, which is efficiency. Like we saw in the Brownian in the connectivity explosion and the inefficiencies that set in if you use the brand well. And mind you, all these conversations around brand are not the conventional perception of brands. I'm not talking about advertising, I'm not talking about logo design. We talk about brands and branding in a different manner, and I'm seriously hoping that we are relating to that. It is about the integrative or convergent role of brands at one level. It is about brands as an interface. Another big theme that we figured from the best global brands and the best Indian brands that we're doing now in this year is that brands, apart from being an anchor and a platform to converge in a proliferated, interconnected world, have a huge role as an interface. Brands are an interface. What do they interface? Brands interface technology with people. Brands are the most powerful interface for technology to create meaningful experiences for people. Technology by itself is cold. Technology by itself has no meaning. Who converts that into a meaningful experience for consumers, for people? Brands can do that. Therefore, brand at the second level is an interface. And if we can do that, it will drive growth. The key components, again, people. And as we go into that entire construct of brands being interface and brands being an anchor point, it devolves upon people, it devolves upon the internal organizations. And a lot of us really look after functions, look after marketing, and look after the brand. We don't really look after people inside our organizations. That's really the job of the HR head, the chief people's officer, and so on and so forth. So how do I influence that? And those are structural challenges that organizations have. Because as head of brand and head of marketing, or as person in charge of delivering experiences outside in this connected world, this changing world, you got a responsibility. Now you also know, and some of the best Indian brands are beginning to do that. We work with some of them already. The usage of brand for creating internal cultures is gaining ground, and rightfully so. When we say brands, we mean customer brands. It's taken for granted. Somebody saying brand, he must mean, if not advertising and design, definitely customer brand. But brands are not customer brands alone. Brands are customer brands, brands are employee brands, brands are employer brands, brands are investor brands, brands are community brands. Brands have all these different facets to themselves that need to be joined at the hip. They need to mirror the same DNA, the same core. And that's what we need to understand when we begin to look at the context of people in brands being an interface. Well, if you got to deliver meaningful, connected experiences which are different, which are new today, you got to have people inside who can deliver that experience. And therefore, we firmly believe great brands begin within. We have this tendency of rushing to our creative agency and getting a film done, and we launch it outside in media and we create a brand. I'm sorry, that's not the right way. You need to create a culture with your brand inside. Get your people and anchor that culture in the brand and work with. And there are a whole lot of organizations today around the world and in India where the brand, the marketing, and the people's function are working together to do an internal transformation around the brand. One of the simplest ways of understanding what brands do is they create values and culture on the inside so that you can deliver customer experience on the outside. As simple as that. Technology is not just about convenience, not just about being able to have a remote connection because we have bandwidth and a device. Technology has got to move from proximity to connection. And that's again where brands come into play, where they translate the positive utility into meaningful experience. We talked about the first basic role brands can play around being an anchor, being an integrator. But brands can be a lot more than integrators. They can be an accelerator. It's about anchoring and accelerating at the same time. There is, if you look at the best global brands, the most recent best global brands, the 100 brands in the world, there is one sector that jumps out. There's one sector which might surprise some of you. It's the best performing sector in the top 100 brands of the world as measured by us. And it's the sector called luxury. The luxury brands are creating an impact which is unparalleled. 42% growth of the luxury sector happened in the last year, and that's something which I'd request Rebecca to say a few words about.
Thank you. I'll try not to reveal too much because I'm hoping some of you will attend the session tomorrow. But I think the first important point to raise is that I've been involved with Best Global Brands for the past 8 to 9 years that I've been heading up our global luxury sector practice. And one thing that you notice, and it's not necessarily a testament to in the slide you see in front of you, let's remember luxury is not a category. Luxury is not a category. When we think about Aston Martin, brands occupy a space of excellence that happens to be in automotive. They occupy a space of excellence that happens to be in fashion, that happens to be in jewelry or hospitality. I think it's a very important distinction, and that's one that we'll come on to talk a little bit about tomorrow. But certainly the proof points that Ashish has been talking about, that great brands begin from within, the exponential shift that we've been seeing in the past 3 or 4 years, if you track the data, because what excites me actually is not just the annual data, but when you start to look at this, we've been doing this for almost 20 years now. So the exponential S-curves, the shifts, the growth trajectories that we'll come to talk about in more detail tomorrow, really get under the skin in terms of the engine room of the brand and what's going on. But when Ashish talked about great brands begin from within, that is certainly something that we are seeing a big shift in with a lot of the luxury brands that you see here. I can't say who, but there are a number of luxury brands that we're working with right now on exactly that. How do we attract, retain, motivate talent? These are powerful questions, especially when, and we were talking to some journalists earlier on, there are imperatives out there for a 22-year-old these days to go anywhere in the world and to work for some of the best companies. A lot of those are in tech, a lot of those are in startups. So how do you, as a legacy luxury brand, compete with that, compete against that? So that's a fascinating look in terms of actually how these brands are retooling and re-engineering. So thank you, Ashish, for a little bit of airtime today to tee up what we'll come on to talk about in more detail tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. She would be holding forth on this subject, but essentially, the big headline and the big learning from the global brands, the top 100 global brands in the year gone by, is the fact that there is a luxury mindset that is being adopted by brands outside luxury, and we could, in a simpler way, we could call it premiumization. In a simpler way, we could call it moving up the value chain. We could call it driving profitability. But how do you do that? And it's no surprise that luxury as a sector has been doing it forever. We're just discovering it through the principles of branding. But luxury in its own way, and any market, any society, and even the historic, the ancient luxury that we've had in our country, in our society, the principles of luxury have been the same. And they've intuitively been very, very highly driven by a brand. They don't call it brand, but intrinsically they do what brands espouse. What do they do really? They create these delightful experiences. I mean, if we call it in simpler language, we call it plush, and we call it sophisticated, and we call it rich. But it's about experiences that luxury brands always created. And that's what the world is growing up to now. We're talking about experiences across different sectors. We're talking about auto sector, retail, and then how experience really drives value. We talk about experience economy. There is hyper customer centricity that luxury's always done. Luxury's been personalization and customization. And that's what the rest of the world is waking up to and creating value. Luxury is about excellence and craft. And that's what if you look at the products that we made in the Indian market 10 years back, and a Ciaz from Maruti versus what Maruti did 10-15 years back. We are growing up to details, to craftsmanship, and getting better. And a lot of brands outside luxury but that's what luxury's done always. It's about culture. There is a culture that you have. It's a Hermes or a Gucci or a Louis Vuitton. They're a culture. They spawn a culture. There are myths, there are anecdotes, and there are things that they do. And brands, the lesser brands are beginning to learn that. So I think the big theme, the whole lot of other things that we love to talk about, I think the big headline, and that's why Rebecca is here to talk about it tomorrow in greater detail, is adopting a luxury mindset is what's driven value in a significant manner around the world and in India. That's what creates the DNA to face the change and the challenges of change. And the Best Indian Brands 2019, the reason why we said it's the year of reckoning is because we're seeing palpable, we're seeing solid, tangible results along those principles that were only part of conversations earlier. Now they are paying off, and that's why it's a year of reckoning globally and locally. Now, how does the luxury mindset drive value? How do strong brands drive value? It's along these principles that we define. There are these 10 factors, so to say, that are definitive in terms of their contribution to a strong brand. We call it brand strength factors. There are 4 internal factors and 6 external factors. They also constitute the backbone of brand value. The internal factors are around clarity, commitment, governance, and responsiveness. Each of them have a whole lot of sub-metrics underneath, but we'll not go into those details. But these are what make a brand a strong internal brand. How clear you are about the brand internally, your employees, how committed you are to the brand, how well governed the brand is, and this is of special importance because of the proliferation in the connectivity Brownian. Who's got what roles at central and local and zonal levels? We've seen so many brands lose their way because they just proliferated mindlessly. It just wasn't governed. There was no governance model that was created for the brand. And responsiveness is probably the most important one in the scheme of things with the change around, is unless you are predictive, unless you are anticipatory, unless you have foresight, you have an insight, it's of lesser value. You got to have foresight. And that's what responsiveness is about. So and there are, from global brand lists, there are these exemplary examples, exemplary brands. Disney is clearly about what it is about, around the original promise of magic, and everything is built around that. Super clear as a brand. Internally, everybody in Disney knows that. Commitment is exemplified by IKEA and Coke. I mean, in stark contrast with, say, a Pepsi. Coke is so well governed and therefore so consistent around the world. Responsiveness is exemplified by Amazon because it's responded so much to the changing needs that you've even forgotten what business it began with. We all know what it began with, and we all know how difficult it is to describe what Amazon does today. It's so super responsive. It's one of the fastest value creating brands in the best global brands. It's an institution today. What we really meant as Year of Reckoning for Best Indian Brands is that we're beginning to see tangible results around those. There isn't, I wouldn't say copying, I wouldn't say being inspired, because maybe mirroring is the right word. These brands, these stories are not really an aping of the global brands. These are stories in their own right, where Mahindra creates super clarity around its brand. And that's exemplary. Jio, in spite of all the conversations, the commitment that the organization showed behind building Jio as a brand is immense. And no wonder, in less than 4 years' time, it's a brand that by itself has a legitimate position in the best global brands, best Indian brands, even if we kept it outside Reliance. It's become so powerful, it's transformed the sector. Godrej is the first master brand in India, almost 9 years back. With the rebrand, and it's charted that course. It's demonstrated how strong master brands can be built in India. Britannia, which rebranded itself recently to move from a biscuits company to a total global foods company, realizing that the connect that it had with youth is lost, and therefore it needed to do a slew of over 50 innovations over 1 year. moving outside biscuits and looking at the brand in a different way. The next set of three external factors: authenticity, huge brand there. Harley Davidson, it's as authentic as you can get. People ink it on their skin. It's a tattoo. You wear it, and we talk about wearing your brand, and people actually wear Harley Davidson. Google, which is so powerful about understanding the needs and creating those products and services. Their power is probably bigger than many governments around the world, and we all know that. Differentiation. Mini from BMW is it's a small car. It's a small luxury car. They created a brand which was very different from the small car that this market created, which confused its positioning with its corporate PR. World's cheapest car, Nano and Tata, and nobody wants to drive a vehicle that says it's the cheapest car in the world. Mini, on the other hand, is a small car, but it's a small luxury car, and people pay that price because it differentiated itself around the experience, around what we call excitement, midnight excitement at downtown. Do we have examples? Can we see mirroring examples in the best Indian brands? We do. Well, there is Royal Enfield. That's the list that I'll share in a few minutes. Royal Enfield has been one of the top growth driving brands in the best Indian brands. It's for the third year in succession. Incredible growth. Isn't that authenticity? And isn't that the value that a brand's created? You got an exemplary growth story in Maruti. Sometimes we tend to take it for granted and not recognize what it's doing. But it's a sector, it's auto sector. Auto sector, as many of you would know, is one of the most competitive sectors that we have. It's got all the top brands in the world. India is a targeted market because for many of the global auto brands, India is one of the top markets, if not the first, one of the top 3 markets to target. Everybody's putting all its might in India. And in that context, there is this brand which is proudly Indian, and it's still the leading brand in the auto sector. And it's, why is it so? Because it's doing things ahead of time. I mean, it didn't cut too much of ice, but they launched automatic drive in an entry level called Celerio. It's understanding what's relevant and incessantly creating those products and services. Differentiation. Now we spoke about the luxury mindset and how the global brands outside luxury segment are adopting that to drive value globally. Well, we've had our own luxury segment, and that's jewelry. And we've had a brand, the only retail brand that figured in Best Indian Brands, because rest of the retail brands, offline or online, were actually burning money, and they weren't making any money, and we couldn't really create. And a lot of people asked us, why aren't those brands figuring? And we can't really value a brand that makes losses. And the only retail brand that created value was Tanishq for all these years. And it did so because it charges 15, 20, 25% premium on gold price. It leveraged design. Design creates value. Design was the lever for the brand. The last 3 factors: consistency, presence, and engagement. Well, Apple is Apple. Apple Store is as Apple platform, an Apple device, an Apple product, an Apple experience. Starbucks is pervasive, and Lego engages to an extent that it kind of reaches co-creation. Well, in spite of all the governance issues, and we've seen it in BFSI, it's difficult for banks and brands to really converge in one brand. They end up creating multiple companies, multiple brands. ICICI has done a good job there. Presence, and a niche bank and Kotak drove brand value through driving presence in the last year. And engagement is Big Bazaar is about how, we spoke about the larger canvas of luxury mindset, and we know Big Bazaar, which is the new entrant The first time a retail brand, True Blue retail brand, and hypermarkets entering the West Indian brands is Big Bazaar. And from the history of it being an absolute value for money brand, in the recent years, it has moved up the value chain. You see designer co-brands at Big Bazaar. You see an experience at Big Bazaar. You see things, of course, it doesn't do it as well as a Louis Vuitton and an Hermes, but consider the fact that they came from a background and they're moving up, and applaud that. And they've adopted luxury mindset in their own way. The same story goes for the sectors. We looked at the brands, and if you look at the sectors, in the top 40 in 2019, the biggest sector is technology, where we club IT and telecom. The second biggest is financial. And then there is automotive and retail. But what's more interesting is if you look at the growth figures, the sectors that are really driving growth are retail and automotive, and they're driving growth because they inherently provision for some of the principles that we spoke about. They provision for experience, they provision for innovation, they provision for culture, they provision for adoption of a luxury mindset. Growth is what we really celebrate. We spoke about driving growth in a changing world, in an ever-changing world. Growth is what takes bravery. You could stick to your position, and we firmly believe that you cannot stick to your position. We said you either grow or you die. There's no way you can be where you are. If you're trying to be where you are and be agnostic to the change around you, you will perish. And therefore growth is where the brave stories are. And these are the people who understood that you can't be agnostic to the change around you. You got to drive growth. And the fight that had driven growth in the most exemplary manner it begins with Tanishq, which is another endorsement of the global mega theme of the luxury mindset. We see 21% growth in brand value from Tanishq. We see 20% growth from Royal Enfield, which is again experience and elements of luxury mindset being brought into the auto sector in the most exemplary manner. We see Kotak, which has driven presence and is also adopted some of the principles. We see another auto sector brand, Bajaj, which has grown by 18%. Innovations and looking at, they recently began to redefine their business, which is something that's common with the fifth fastest growing brand, that's Ashok Leyland, at 16%. Both the last two auto sector brands have seriously begun to consider redefinition of their business from automotive to mobility. Automotive as a service is a serious conversation that is going on in these companies. That's why they're growing. That's why they're the top 5 growth brands. The 3 new entrants, we spoke about Big Bazaar and adoption of the luxury mindset, and howsoever bizarre it may sound for a Sasta and Acha brand like Big Bazaar to be spoken about as an adopter of luxury mindset. And there is a hugely profitable business, D-Mart, that's made its way as well, and Narolac, which has began investing in the brand in a serious manner. HDFC remains as the 4th brand in the top 100. It's grown by 14%, phenomenal business, one of the most profitable financial organizations and brands that we have in the country consistently. Many reasons for their growth story. Their adoption of technology, their creation of experience, their being conservative, their being solid, and being true to the core. And they adopted, they created Pay Zap and became popular much before people started thinking about mobile applications. Airtel remains at number 3. Airtel's lost 13%. It's had a negative growth of 13% in its brand value over last year. Could it be because there is a powerhouse brand in form of Jio that has really bolstered Reliance by 12%? Could it be because a brand came into the market in form of Jio and reinvented the category, and brands that classically define themselves as telecom service provider didn't really know how to react? Tata remains the most valuable Indian brand for the 6th year in a row. It's not grown too much. It's a moderate growth of 6%. But if you look at it in the context of the table, the 40 brands and the aggregated growth, it's 5.2%. So in that context, Tata is just grown as much as the average and not beyond. But what's more interesting is the growth of Tata has been contributed by TCS. Reliance is driven by the newer sectors. Well, they still continue to perform phenomenally well on the legacy businesses. But the newer growth is being driven by newer sectors, the customer-facing sectors like technology, like Geo, like retail, which is trends. And those sectors are coming into their own in this, which is why it was the year of reckoning. Tata is being driven by the technology sector as well. So friends, this is the top 40 most valuable brands that we have. We've spoken about the top performers. Tata remains the top one. Reliance, Airtel, HDFC, LIC and SBI as the PSU brands that have marginal growths. Infosys, Mahindra, ICICI and Godrej make up the top 10. And happy to present this to you and have conversations around it in the evening that follows. And happy to also confirm that many of these brands have had a year of reckoning and have begun to really mirror some of the big value drivers around the world, whether it's luxury brand adoption, whether it is experience, whether it is using brands to integrate. So thanks a lot for coming, and we hope to make the point that it is about growth and change. You grow because you change, and you change because of growth. And that's what we should keep in mind. Thanks a lot.